27,000 feet above Germany, October 14th, 1943. Staff Sergeant Michael Archangelo was cramped inside the plexiglass bubble of his ball turret, frozen air seeping through every seal, when he saw the Focke-Wulf 190 coming straight at him. 400 miles per hour. Head on. Closing fast. The ball turret was the most vulnerable position on a B-17 flying fortress. A transparent sphere bolted to the bomber's belly, barely large enough for a man curled in the fetal position. 2 50-caliber machine guns, a computing gun sight, and you, suspended in space with nothing between you and the enemy, but half an inch of plexiglass. The temperature inside the turret hovered at 40 degrees below zero. Archangelo wore electrically heated flight suits, but the heating elements rarely worked properly. Ice formed on the inside of the plexiglass. His breath froze into crystals that stuck to his oxygen mask. The hydraulic fluid that rotated the turret thickened in the cold, making every movement sluggish and delayed. The turret itself was a marvel of terrible engineering. Sperry Corporation had designed it to give the bomber complete belly coverage. But to fit it into the B-17's fuselage, they'd made it so small that only men under 5'7" and under 160 pounds could operate it. Archangelo was 5'5" and weighed 142 pounds. He fit perfectly, which meant he'd been condemned to this frozen hell for every mission. Entry required contortion. You climbed through the bomber's belly hatch, positioned yourself over the turret opening, then folded yourself into the sphere like origami. Once inside, you couldn't stand, couldn't stretch. Your knees were tucked against your chest for the entire mission. 8 hours. Sometimes 10. The claustrophobia was worse than the cold. If the bomber's landing gear malfunctioned, if the hydraulics failed, you couldn't get out. The turret would be crushed on landing with you inside it. Every ball turret gunner knew this. They'd heard the stories. They tried not to think about it. But right now, Archangelo wasn't thinking about hydraulics or landing gear. He was thinking about the Focke-Wulf. Every fiber of his training told him to wait, hold fire, let the enemy fighter fill his gun sight. That's what the manual demanded. That's what 6 months of gunnery school had hammered into his skull. Archangelo didn't wait. At 1,200 yards, 4 times beyond maximum effective range, he squeezed both triggers. His twin 50-caliber machine guns erupted. Tracers streaked into empty sky. At 800 yards, the German fighter's nose lit up. 20mm cannon shells coming straight at his belly. Then something happened. The Focke-Wulf twitched, just barely. The pilot had seen those tracers. They weren't close enough to kill him, but they were close enough to make him doubt his angle. That adjustment saved Archangelo's life. The cannon rounds that should have shredded his ball turret missed by 15 feet. They tore through the B-17's right wing instead. Over the intercom, his pilot's voice crackled with anger. "Ball turret, what the hell were you shooting at? That fighter was out of range." Archangelo didn't answer. He was watching the German fighter circle around, hesitating now, calculating, wondering if that American gunner had just gotten lucky, or if he actually knew something. That morning, Archangelo had discovered something that contradicted every word in the Army Air Force's training manual. Something that shouldn't work. But it worked. The problem had started in 1942, when the first flying fortresses arrived in England. Boeing had built a bomber with 13 50-caliber machine guns that they promised could defend itself without fighter escort. The Luftwaffe proved them wrong in 3 weeks, August 17th, 1942. 12 B-17s attacked Rouen, France. German fighters came in fast, head-on attacks at closing speeds over 500 miles per hour. The American gunners fired. They followed their training. They waited for clear shots. They missed, every single one of them. The problem wasn't the guns. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun was one of the finest weapons ever made. John Browning had designed it in 1918, and by 1942 it had been refined to near perfection. Rate of fire, 800 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity, 2,900 feet per second. Effective range on paper, 2,000 yards, but paper didn't account for human reaction time. At a closing speed of 500 miles per hour, 2 aircraft covered 733 feet per second. That meant a fighter went from 800 yards to point-blank range in less than 3 seconds. In that time, the gunner had to identify the target, calculate deflection, aim, and fire. And the target was diving, rolling, jinking. The commanders studied the gun camera footage and reached an obvious conclusion. The gunners were firing too late. By the time a German fighter filled the gun sight, the closing speed was too high. The gunner had maybe half a second before the fighter flashed past. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They understood that if they came in fast enough, if they committed fully to a head-on attack, the American gunner would wait for the perfect moment and squeeze the trigger just a fraction too late. The statistics were brutal. Fall of 1942. 8th Air Force lost 4% of its bombers every mission. A crew had to fly 25 missions to complete their tour. Do the mathematics. 4% loss rate, 25 missions. Your odds of survival were approximately 0. The actual calculation was even worse than it appeared. A 4% loss rate per mission meant that on any given mission, 96% of bombers returned. But over 25 missions, you multiplied 0.96 by itself 25 times. The result, 0.36, 36% survival rate. Less than 4 in 10 crews completed their tours, and those numbers included every position on the bomber. Ball turret gunners had it worse. When a fighter attacked head-on, they were the primary target. When flak hit the bomber's belly, they caught it first. When the bomber crash-landed, they were often trapped. By spring of 1943, the average life expectancy of a ball turret gunner was 11 missions. Archangelo was on his 17th. He'd already beaten the odds. Every mission now felt like borrowed time. The commanders tried everything. Changed formations, added more guns, trained harder. Nothing worked. By summer of 1943, some gunners were calling themselves clay pigeons. They knew a head-on attack from a Fokker-Wulf 190 meant they had about 3 seconds to live. The American gunners fired at 400 yards. The German pilots fired at 600 yards. The Germans always fired first. This was the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement. The German fighter carried 4 20mm cannons. Each cannon fired explosive shells that could tear a bomber apart. The shells were slow compared to 50 caliber bullets, but they didn't need to be precise. A near miss was enough. The explosive radius did the work. The American gunner had to score direct hits. A 50 caliber bullet could kill a fighter, but only if it hit something vital: the engine, the fuel tank, the pilot. And at combat speeds, Hitting a fighter head-on was like shooting a bullet with another bullet. What made ball turret duty particularly brutal was the isolation. The rest of the crew could see each other. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side. The bombardier and navigator worked together in the nose. The waist gunners stood back to back. The radio operator and top turret gunner could communicate directly. But the ball turret gunner was alone, separated from the crew by the fuselage floor, connected only by the intercom, which often failed or filled with static. When fighters attacked, he could hear the other gunners calling out positions, but he couldn't see them, couldn't coordinate. He was fighting his own private war in his plexiglass bubble. The isolation created a strange psychological effect. Some gunners became hyper-vigilant, spinning their turrets constantly, searching for threats that might not exist. Others became passive, waiting for orders that might come too late. The successful ones, like Archangelo, found a mental equilibrium. They stayed alert without panicking. They trusted their instincts. Archangelo's father had taught him about focus in the machine shop. When you're operating a lathe, you can't let your mind wander. But you also can't be tense. Tension makes you clumsy. You need calm attention, complete presence in the moment. That's what Archangelo brought to the ball turret. Calm attention. When fighters approached, his heart rate didn't spike. His breathing stayed steady. He rotated the turret smoothly, tracking the target, calculating angles. And when the moment came to fire, his decision was instantaneous, but not panicked. This mental state was rare. Most gunners never achieved it. They were too scared or too angry or too frozen by the sheer unreality of combat at 27,000 feet. But the ones who found that calm focus survived longer. They made better decisions. They saw patterns others missed. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe had perfected Sturmgruppe. Storm groups, heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190s with extra armor, and 4 20mm cannons. These fighters didn't dodge. They just came straight in at full throttle. The Sturmbock variant of the Focke-Wulf carried 30mm of armor plate, protecting the pilot and engine. A 50 caliber round hitting that armor would flatten and bounce off. The only way to kill a Sturmbock was to hit the wings, the tail, or get lucky with a shot through the canopy. But the armor made the fighter heavy. It couldn't dogfight. It couldn't climb quickly. Its only advantage was straight-line speed and the ability to absorb punishment. So the Sturmbock pilots developed a simple tactic: point the nose at a bomber and don't deviate. Fire at maximum range. Keep firing until you broke off or died. The tactic worked because of human psychology. When a fighter came at you at 500 miles per hour, your brain screamed at you to shoot now. But if you fired too early, you wasted ammunition. If you fired too late, you were dead. The German pilots knew the Americans would wait, would try to be accurate. And while the Americans were aiming, the Germans were already firing. October 14th, 1943. The Schweinfurt raid. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s deep into Germany. 60 didn't come back. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 650 men were killed, wounded, or captured. They called it Black Thursday. The target was ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. Intelligence had determined that destroying these factories would cripple German tank and aircraft production. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. The bombers flew without long-range fighter escort. The P-47s escorting them had to turn back over the German border. From that point to the target and back, the bombers were alone for nearly 4 hours. The Luftwaffe had known they were coming. German radar had tracked the formation from the moment it crossed the English Channel. By the time the bombers reached Schweinfurt, every available fighter in Western Germany was airborne and waiting. After Black Thursday, commanders interviewed every surviving gunner. The pattern was clear. Gunners who fired early, who opened up at 800 or 1,000 yards, survived more often. But firing early made no sense. At 1,000 yards, a Focke-Wulf was the size of a pencil eraser. The chances of actually hitting it were essentially 0. So why did the early shooters survive? Archangelo flew with the B-17 Hell's Angel, 303rd Bomb Group. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's machine shop in Philadelphia. He understood mechanical systems and the physics of rotating objects. The machine shop had taught him to think in terms of tolerances and margins. When you machined a part, you didn't aim for perfection. You aimed for acceptable variance. If a bolt needed to be 10 millimeters wide, you made it 9.98 to 10.02. Anything in that range worked. He applied the same thinking to aerial gunnery. You didn't need a perfect shot. You needed an acceptable solution. And an acceptable solution was anything that made the enemy pilot abort his attack. And he understood something the training manuals didn't teach. A machine gun wasn't just a weapon. It was a signal, a warning system, a way to change the mathematics of a dogfight before it even started. After the mission, Archangelo talked to other gunners. Most thought he was crazy, but a few listened. They'd seen fighters hesitating, pulling up early, breaking off attacks when the tracers started flying. One gunner put it simply: "They're not Superman. They don't want to die either. If they see tracers, they think twice." The breakthrough came in November 1943 over the North Sea. Archangelo's B-17 was limping back from Bremen. A lone Focke-Wulf was stalking them from 2,000 yards back. Archangelo made a decision. He opened fire immediately. At 2,000 yards, he wasn't aiming at the fighter. He was aiming at the space the fighter wanted to use. The Focke-Wulf saw the tracers. It broke left, climbed, circled around, came in from a different angle. Archangelo fired again. Another wall of tracers. This happened 4 times. Each time the pilot tried a different approach. Each time Archangelo fired early. Each time the pilot saw the tracers and changed his mind. After the 4th attempt, the Focke-Wulf gave up and turned back toward Germany. Archangelo had fired maybe 200 rounds. He hadn't hit anything, but he'd survived. The training manual said, "Wait for the enemy to commit, then fire accurately. Kill him." But Archangelo realized the goal wasn't to kill the enemy. The goal was to survive, and survival didn't require a kill. It just required making the enemy pilot doubt. When Archangelo landed, he found the armorer, a sergeant named DiMaggio. He explained what he'd discovered. DiMaggio understood immediately. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking a B-17 was doing mathematics in his head. He had maybe 5 seconds to line up the shot. Once he committed, he was locked in. If tracers started coming at him during those 5 seconds, before he was ready, he had a choice. He could ignore them or abort. Most pilots aborted. Not because they were cowards, but because they were rational. Why press an attack against a bomber already shooting when you can find one that isn't? What Archangelo discovered, involved three factors that nobody at gunnery school had explained properly. First, bullet trajectory at extreme range. At 27,000 feet, the air was thin. Bullets flew flatter and farther. At 1,200 yards, a .50 caliber round still carried 1,800 foot-pounds of energy, enough to make a pilot think twice. Second, the cone of fire. When you fired a machine gun, bullets spread out in a cone. At 1,000 yards, 30 feet wide. At 1,500 yards, 50 feet. The training manual treated this as a problem. Archangelo realized it was an advantage. You didn't have to aim precisely, just generally. Third, the human factor. Every fifth round was a tracer that burned bright orange. At 1,000 yards, those tracers looked like orange streaks coming straight at your face. The human brain is wired to fear things coming at the face. Even experienced pilots felt it. But survival required understanding, deflection, shooting at range. When a fighter attacked head-on, it was diving at a 30-degree angle. At 500 miles per hour, that fighter was dropping vertically at 250 feet per second. You had to aim at where the fighter would be. Archangelo found a shortcut. He aimed at his own bomber's wings. If a fighter was diving at your bomber, and you wanted to hit it at 1,000 yards, you had to aim high enough that your tracers would arc over your own wings. Your wings became the reference point. The bullets would climb for 500 yards, peak, then drop. If the fighter stayed on its dive path, it would fly into that dropping cone at around 800 yards. And even if it didn't get hit, it would see the tracers in the exact place it wanted to fly through. The pilot would abort. The technique spread through the 303rd Bomb Group like a rumor. By January 1944, maybe a dozen gunners were doing it. January 11th, over Oschersleben, a waist gunner named Jack Murphy watched a Messerschmitt 109 stalking his separated B-17. Murphy opened fire immediately at 1,800 yards. The Messerschmitt pilot saw the tracers and broke off. This happened 6 times over 10 minutes. Murphy burned through 400 rounds without hitting anything. But the Messerschmitt never got closer than 1,200 yards, Murphy's pilot told the other pilots in the squadron. By February, the technique was spreading. Word traveled through the unofficial network of sergeants and mechanics. A ball turret gunner named Sam Feinstein started teaching it to new crews. "You aim through your own wings," he'd say. "Sounds crazy, but it works. They see the tracers. They think twice." The new gunners were skeptical, but Feinstein had flown 23 missions. He was still alive. That counted for something. By March 1944, maybe 200 gunners across 3 bomb groups were using the technique. They just called it shooting early. The officers didn't acknowledge it. It wasn't in the manual, but the loss rates were dropping. In January, the 303rd had lost 7 bombers. In February, 5. In March, 3. The turning point came in late February, during Big Week. The 8th Air Force sent 1,000 bombers deep into Germany. Hundreds of gunners opened up at extreme range. The sky filled with tracers. The German pilots saw the tracers and hesitated. They broke off attacks. They looked for gaps. But there were no gaps. Every bomber had at least 1 gunner firing early. The Luftwaffe pilots called it the Feuerwand, the wall of fire. During Big Week, the 8th Air Force lost about 6% of its force. Before the early fire technique, loss rates had been running at 10% and or higher. The technique had cut losses by 1/3. German fighter pilots started reporting something strange. American gunners were firing much earlier at ranges where hits should be impossible. At first, Luftwaffe intelligence thought it was panic, but then the loss rates came in. The ratio had shifted from 1 fighter lost per 2 bombers to 1 fighter per 4 bombers. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with 204 kills, was one of the first to understand. June 15th, 1944, he dove on a B-17. At 1,400 yards, tracers started coming. At 1,200 yards, something hit his left wing. 1 bullet, 1 lucky hit at absurd range. After landing, Baer examined the damage. It hadn't damaged anything critical, but it had damaged his confidence. The next time he attacked, he'd remember that hit. He'd hesitate. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They tried stern attacks from behind. But waist gunners compensated with the same technique. They tried mass attacks from multiple angles, but that required coordination, radio discipline, and fuel that by late 1944 they didn't have. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was that the Americans had changed the equation. It used to be close fast, fire at 600 yards, break away. Now it was close fast, encounter tracers at 1,400 yards, decide whether to continue. Most pilots aborted, not from cowardice, but from rationality. Why press an attack against a bomber already shooting when you can find an easier target? The problem was that by late 1944, every bomber was shooting early. There were no easy targets left. By September 1944, Luftwaffe fighter effectiveness against heavy bombers had dropped to 40% of what it had been in 1943. By the end of 1944, the early fire method had become semi-official doctrine. It still wasn't in the training manuals, but squadron commanders encouraged it. Veterans pulled new gunners aside. Forget what they taught you at gunnery school. Out here, you shoot early. You shoot high. In 1943, American bomber gunners fired an average of 3,000 rounds for every confirmed fighter kill. By late 1944, that number had dropped to 1,800 rounds per kill, not because accuracy had improved, but because fewer fighters were pressing their attacks all the way in. Michael Archangelo flew his 25th mission on March 3rd, 1945. He'd survived. He'd shot down 2 confirmed fighters, both at ranges under 600 yards. But he'd driven off dozens more at long range. He never received a medal for developing the technique. The Army Air Forces didn't want to admit that a sergeant had figured out something their PhDs and generals had missed. Archangelo didn't care. He went home to Philadelphia, worked in his father's machine shop, got married, had 3 kids, died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary mentioned he'd served in World War II. It didn't mention that he'd changed aerial combat forever, but the technique survived him. In Korea, B-29 gunners used it against MiG-15 jets. In Vietnam, helicopter door gunners applied the same principle. The Air Force finally studied it formally in the 1980s. They ran computer simulations and analyzed historical data. The conclusion: early defensive fire, even inaccurate fire, reduced attack effectiveness by 30 to 40%. They gave it an official name: preemptive defensive engagement. The doctrine is taught at the Air Force Weapons School today. Modern fighter pilots learn that if you're defending against an attack, you don't wait for the perfect shot. You engage early. You make them react to you. The F-35's targeting system is programmed with this logic. If a threat is detected at long range, The system recommends immediate engagement, not to kill, to disrupt. It's the same principle Archangelo discovered in 1943. The technique also influenced the phalanx system on Navy ships. The automated gunfires at extreme range, putting up a wall of tungsten. The goal isn't to hit the missile directly, but to fill the airspace with metal. Archangelo would have understood it immediately. Archangelo never considered himself a hero. When people used that word, he'd shake his head. The heroes didn't come home, he'd say. He meant the men who'd died, the ones who'd gone down with their bombers over Germany, the ones who'd bailed out and spent years in POW camps, but his grandson saw it differently. You saved lives, Grandpa. Not just your own. Everyone who learned what you figured out. Maybe, Archangelo would say, but I was just trying to get home. That's all any of us were trying to do. This humility was common among the men who'd fought. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as ordinary people who'd been put in extraordinary circumstances and done what they had to do. In the end, what Archangelo discovered wasn't really about guns or bullets or tactics. It was about human nature. He understood that a German fighter pilot diving at his bomber wasn't a machine. He was a man, probably 25 years old, probably scared, probably wanting to go home just like Archangelo wanted to go home. And that man, in the split second of his attack, was making human decisions, balancing risk and reward, calculating odds, feeling fear. If you could tap into that fear, if you could make the risk calculation change, you could survive without ever firing a perfect shot. The German pilot wasn't your enemy because he was evil. He was your enemy because he was trying to kill you, and you were trying to kill him. But underneath that, he was still human, still vulnerable to doubt and fear. And if you understood that, you could change the outcome of the fight. Michael Archangelo's final mission on March 3rd, 1945, was routine by late war standards. The target was Berlin. The Luftwaffe put up maybe 50 fighters. The bomber formation had P-51 escorts. Archangelo rotated his ball turret and watched the fighters approach. He fired early, as always, put tracers into the sky at ranges where hitting anything was pure chance. The fighters broke off, looked for easier targets, found none. The bombs fell. The formation turned west and flew home to England. Archangelo climbed out of his ball turret when they landed. His legs were cramped, his back ached. He'd been curled in that plexiglass sphere for 8 hours. He walked away from Hell's Angel and didn't look back. He'd done his tour. 25 missions. He was going home. Today, at Nellis Air Force Base, fighter pilots sit in classrooms and learn about preemptive defensive engagement. They watch videos. They study simulations. None of them know about Michael Archangelo. None of them know about Hell's Angel or the 303rd Bomb Group or the October morning over Schweinfurt when a 22-year-old gunner figured out something that would change air combat forever. But they learn the technique. They practice it. They'll use it if they ever have to fight. And somewhere, in the future, in some war that hasn't been fought yet, a pilot will fire early at an approaching threat. Will put rounds into empty sky, will make an enemy hesitate, and they'll survive because of what a machinist from Philadelphia figured out 80 years ago. The men who flew in B-17 ball turrets have almost all passed now, but the technique they developed survives. It's in the doctrine, in the training, in the software that runs modern weapon systems, and somewhere, in a dogfight over the Pacific or the Middle East, a pilot will fire early. Will put rounds into empty sky. Will make an enemy think twice. And they'll survive because of what a 22-year-old machinist from Philadelphia figured out at 27,000 feet over Germany in 1943. That one man, breaking the rules, ignoring the manual, trusting his instincts, changed the mathematics of air combat forever. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because when a Focke-Wulf 190 was diving at his bomber at 400 miles per hour, he wanted to live. And in that moment, frozen at 27,000 feet, he made a choice that contradicted everything he'd been taught. He fired early. That choice rippled forward through time, through Korea, through Vietnam, through every air battle that came after. It started in a ball turret over Schweinfurt, with a man who understood that survival wasn't about following the manual. It was about understanding the enemy, understanding fear, understanding that a pilot diving at 500 miles per hour was just as human, just as afraid as the gunner shooting at him. And if you could make that pilot doubt, you didn't need to kill him. You just needed him to go away. That understanding saved thousands of lives, and it all started with one man who pressed his triggers 4 times too early and lived to tell about it.